Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this very special session in our Edgware United Adult Education Programme. I'm of an age to remember when there was only one national UK Jewish newspaper, which unlike now was published on a Friday. If you met anyone on Shabbat, they wouldn't say, "Have you read your JC this week?" Rather, they would inquire, "Have you read Chaim Bermant's article?" and follow on with a comment such as, "Wasn't he brave to say that?" Tonight, on the occasion of Chaim Bermant's 25th Yahrzeit, we shall remember a giant among Jewish journalists, and I'm now going to hand over to his son Danny to pay tribute to his father, and then he will introduce other guests who are fond memories of him. Over to you, Danny.
I want to start off by thanking Spencer, Nathan, for putting on the event that taking place this evening. Without his input, without his organisation, this evening's event wouldn't have happened. I also want to thank all of you for coming tonight. It's not a very pleasant weather tonight. The weather's not terribly pleasant, so it's really, I'm just grateful that so many of you from so many different parts of my father's life are here tonight. So I want to start off by saying that it's just hard to believe that 25 years have passed. So much has changed in that time since my father's passing. There's been 9/11, Brexit, Trump, war breaking out all over Europe. Of course, some things haven't changed. Netanyahu is still Prime Minister. I often look at the world around me, both in the Jewish world and the wider world, and wonder what my father would make of it all. How would he look at social media or the political situation in Israel? I'm sure he'd have a thing or two to say about Prince Harry. I can't tell you how many people over the years have come up to me and said, "I wonder what Chaim would have thought of this." What's clear is that 25 years on, he has left an enormous void that no one else has really been able to fill. But he has also left a legacy that we can all learn from. That you can be an Orthodox Jew, but still be unafraid to call out the Orthodox leadership when you see hypocrisy. You could be a proud Zionist, but feel duty-bound to criticize the government at the time, when you feel it's not living up to the standards on which the state was founded. And more relevant than ever, you don't have to be scared to voice unpopular opinions, call out hypocrisy, call out injustice, even if it means upsetting people sometimes. To my father, there were no sacred cows. He would even call out his own friends, but they respected him for it, and they loved him for it. Being a friend means being able to tell someone else when you think they're wrong. And on the receiving end, it's important to be able to hear criticism and take it. He had readers from every corner of the community, both Jewish and non-Jewish. Be they Reform, Orthodox, Haredi, believer, non-believer. I remember even my local MP at the time, John Marshall, being a great fan of my father, he was actually arguing with my neighbours about my father's opinion piece at the time. Even those who strongly disagreed with his views were avid readers. That's almost unheard of today, to be able to actually read somebody you disagree with. We live in an era where it's become, the norm to block or cancel people who have a different opinion from us. My father stood for the very opposite. He once said, when he was speaking about the freedom of the press, he said, "The liberty to cause offence, even outrage, is precisely what freedom of speech is about. It presumes the right to be wrong." Over the course of this evening, we will be hearing very different perspectives of my father. Vivian Wyman will be speaking about my father as a communal figure, as well as his relationship with Israel. Rabbi Jeffrey Cohen will be speaking about my father and his Judaism. And unfortunately, my mother couldn't make it this evening. But my brother and sister are here from Israel, and they'll also be sharing some very personal perspectives. Again, talking about my father. Ozzy will be speaking about my father and his relationship with Israel. Before handing over to some of our speakers, I thought it'd be useful to just hear a little bit about his biography, because there are some younger members of the audience who probably are, and older members, I imagine, who probably were not familiar with some of the different chapters of his life. So I was just going to speak briefly for a few minutes about his life and his times. So, not surprisingly, my father was actually the son of a rabbi. His interest in Judaism came very much from his childhood. He was born in Breslau, Poland, in the 26th of February 1929. He was the product of an intensely Orthodox upbringing. He was immersed in traditional Judaism and retained a love for it throughout his life. He was someone who believed in the spirit of the law rather than the letter. He was sometimes asked about his own beliefs. He said, "I believe in Judaism, but not in rabbis." Although many of his friends were rabbis. Those of you who are familiar with this wording, with this writing, will have seen this again and again. There was a telling remark from someone. This was a telling remark from someone whose father had been a rabbi. In 1933, the family moved to a small, largely Jewish village in Latvia, where my Zayda found himself in charge of 2 local shuls. This experience prompted my father to recall, in relation to the custom of 2 days Yom Tov, that the reason he had 2 days Yom Tov is that my father's father had 2 shuls to speak at. So he had 2 days Yom Tov so he could speak at one shul and then speak at the other shul. My father described his childhood as an idyllic childhood, and he describes it at length in his book Genesis. When my father was 8 years old, the family left to go to Glasgow. And only shortly after he left for Glasgow was the border closed. Had they left 3 months later, I wouldn't be here today. Now, interestingly, my father actually wasn't a refugee. People often think he was a refugee, but he was actually an economic migrant. His father had come to Scotland, worked as a shocket, earned enough money to bring the family over, and then they all came over in 1937. And I'm going to just share with you an interview that my father did about 1980.
Jewish refugee children in the 1930s followed a tradition of Jews who fled here to avoid persecution. Chaim Bermant was 7 years old when his father had been a rabbi in Poland, got a job in Glasgow. Chaim travelled from Poland via Berlin, Ostend and Dover to Scotland when, in 1937, his father sent for his family. Before leaving, they celebrated one last Passover in Poland with relatives.
We were due to leave in July. Passover must have been April, and this was really in the form of a family reunion because we knew that we would never see each other again. Not because we anticipated the Holocaust, but because in those days when you went abroad, you stayed abroad, people didn't come and go visiting. And so my grandparents were there, uncles, aunts, cousins. Grandmother must have had a large house because I remember we all sat around a vast table, and although children always find joy in numbers, I couldn't, even though I was 8, avoid being aware of the certain air of melancholy about the whole gathering. And in fact, we never did see them again. And it was in 1944 that we heard that they had all perished. All the people who had been around the table, my grandmother, uncle, aunts, cousins, very young cousins, most of them, that they'd all died in the Holocaust. Most of them in that very house, in the cellar of the house in which we had the Seder.
How did they die in the cellar?
Well, they were all hiding in the cellar, and one of the children began crying. And the Germans who were upstairs threw some hand grenades down.
What is the most harrowing memory that you had then as a child?
I see it clearly to this day. We were passing the old Jewish cemetery on the way out of Breslov to Borovka, and there was a young girl of 18 crying over her grandmother's grave. And I asked, why she was crying. And apparently her parents had moved on to America. In those days, if you had a child who was backward or ill, you couldn't get to America. She was backward, and she had therefore been abandoned by her parents and had lived with her grandparents. But her grandmother was now dead also. There was none left to her in the world, and she was crying over her grandmother's grave.
What did you think as an 8-year-old child as you saw that?
Well, at first I couldn't understand it, but then, the grief, the agony of it all became very clear to me. I remember it to this very day. It was the most painful memory of my young life. From Poland to Borovka, I went on a cart, like David Copperfield traveled with Barkas, through the villages, through the woods, and then on to Borovka. From Borovka, we went by bus, which was something also quite an exciting occasion, though I had been on a bus before. But the excitement came when we arrived by bus in Dvinsk to the railway station, the Vokzal, a vast, red brick place. I remember to this day. I had my first sight of trains, huge steaming giants, but I actually was able to ascend on a train. And again, the train was very, very packed. There were 3 classes in those days, first class, second class, and as they called them, Chaza class. Wooden benches, not as rough as this, but to me it was all very exciting. I couldn't keep still. I rushed up and down the train. I kept pushing my head out of the window. Mother was half in a panic that I would have my head knocked off by the tunnels. My face was covered with soot because of the smoke from the train. but I enjoyed every minute of it. I remember every carriage. I remember the people sitting there. I remember wandering into a second-class compartment and seeing people smoking what looked like large objects wrapped in brown paper. It's my first glimpse of a cigar.
So you weren't frightened? You were having a good time as a little boy?
A very exciting time for a boy to be on the train, for a boy who had never seen a train.
What was arriving in Berlin like?
Well, again, my mother grew rather worried as we got near Berlin, because we kids had a habit of sort of playing at Nazis, Heil Hitler and so on, that sort of thing. And she was in panic in case she did the same thing when we got to Germany. And as we got into Germany, the trains became very crowded indeed, because there's a lot of troop movements there. There was the Munich crisis, the Czech crisis, and so on, and there were soldiers everywhere, and the train was full of soldiers. I had nowhere to sit. But in fact, one of the German soldiers took me on his knee for a large part of the journey.
And he knew you were Jewish?
I don't know if he knew he was Jewish. I must have looked fairly Jewish, because we came from this small shtetl. I of course had my head covered and had side curls and so on. So I imagine he must have known I was Jewish. And we didn't breathe easily again until we were out of Germany and into Belgium.
And when you reached Belgium, what do you remember most about?
Well, the most exciting thing in Belgium was my first taste of an orange. We had one orange between the five of us. We all had one segment, but tasted as nothing I tasted before. Luscious, fresh, I suppose the taste of heaven, so to speak.
And then what was the sea crossing like?
Sea crossing was a bit of a disappointment, because I thought we were going to America or something like America, and I'd heard stories about voyages lasting for days and so on, and the excitement of it. This particular journey lasted for a few hours, and I was sick for most of the time. It was a crossing between Ostend and Dover.
Did you rush towards your father when you got to Glasgow station?
Well, when he left Latvia, he'd been a sort of Hamish rabbi with side locks, long beard, and a very shaggy one. I mean, he never applied a scissor to it ever. And he also wore a Beckershire, as we called it, a long Prince Albert coat. The jacket went down to his knees and so on. In Glasgow, his side curls, which used to go behind his ears, had vanished. Although he still had a long beard, it was neatly trimmed. And he wore a double-breasted suit. He was in mufti and looked almost immortal like other mortals. But I regarded my father as someone more elevated than that.
Were there any advantages to being a foreign refugee in Glasgow when you were a little boy?
Well, I wasn't a refugee. I was a foreigner, or rather outlandish and so on. I was very conscious of it. There was a disadvantage in that the kids, I wore with great pride my Sunday suit, which was sort of +4s and so on. And kids laughed at my outfit. I had no tie, my jacket buttoned up to the top. And my hair was cropped, because all kids crop their hair in the summer, in case of lice. And kids laughed at me. In Latvia. But the teachers were extremely good to me, and they assigned special kids to look after me. And as a foreigner, I was something of a celebrity. I was invited out to tea, I was invited to parties and so on. I wanted to meet Chaim Bermant. Or actually, on the advice of an aunt, she said nobody could pronounce Chaim. You've got to get yourself a nice Scottish name. Call yourself Jaime. And from about 1938 until I went to university, I was known as Jaime Bermant rather than Chaim Bermant. And then I sort of cashed in my status as a foreigner. I enjoyed it. I gloried in it. And then suddenly in September there came an immense influx of youngsters from Germany and Austria, Jewish youngsters, and they all cleared my pitch.
So I just want to talk very briefly about my father's growing up. So Zayda, as you heard, he was a rabbi of two communities. And in order for us to be able to move to England, he actually sent money home. He sent about £5 a month, which £5 you could live on for a month. Brought the family all over via Thomas Cook. And then he was in Glasgow. He governed at Queen's Park Shul. He wasn't able to speak from the pulpit there. And it was very frustrating for him. He was a shockhead, which he really didn't enjoy doing that. And he was also very frustrated because my father was discovering his love of books. And my father often went to the library. He played truant, so he skipped school and went to the library. And it caused no end of frustration for Zayda. At one stage, the school suspended my father. And Zayda's English wasn't very good. He learned his English from the Sansino Shas. So he looked up in the Shas, suspended, hanged. Right? And the way my father put it was, Father believed in discipline, but thought this was going a bit far. Just speaking a bit more about Glasgow, those early years in Glasgow were also a very sad period. My aunt Liba died at the age of 16. That was a very traumatic time for my father. My father was evacuated shortly into the war, and during the outbreak of the war, he was evacuated to Annan in Dumfriesshire. He was billeted with a farmer and his two sisters, who treated him like a cherished son. They weren't a Jewish family, obviously, and my father said I was the first Jew they'd met. And when they came across an obscure passage in Scripture, they would turn to me, although I was only 9 at the time, they turned to me as if they were reading part of my family history. The sisters were rigorous in ensuring that my father was able to eat kosher food. But after he wrote a letter to his father enthusiastically describing the family's Christmas decorations, Zayda came to take him away. So looking at to the university years. So my father, he was educated at Queen's Park Grammar School. He also received training of religious status in Glasgow Yeshiva. And then he briefly went to Israel. He went to kibbutz in Israel about 1950. Although he said that the plants withered under his every touch. So it wasn't a very successful time. But after 2 years, my father returned to Britain to study politics and economics, first at Glasgow University and then at LSE. From 1955 to 1957, he had a short period as a schoolmaster. He actually taught at Avigdor, and I gather the kids were quite scared of him. My father used to tell me that when he walked to the bus stop, the children would go on to the next bus stop. In fact, one of his books is based on his teaching years. He published a book called Here Endeth the Lesson in 1969, which was based on his time as a schoolmaster. He then, in his early career, he actually first worked in television. He became a scriptwriter for Scottish television and then moved to Granada Television in Manchester, where he was a colleague of Jeremy Isaacs, who is obviously a very well-known producer at One World in Action. He was also involved with a show called Searchlight, that some of you might be familiar with. And then in 1961, he worked for the Jewish Chronicle from 1964 to 1966 as its feature editor. He was a natural freelance with an appetite for work, literary dispatch, and encyclopedic knowledge equal to the hazards and demands which the status imposes. Well, a really pivotal time in his career at the Jewish Chronicle was the Louis Jacobs affair. I won't really go into it, but it was at the time the chief rabbi, Rabbi Israel Brody, had vetoed Rabbi Louis Jacobs' appointment as the head of Jews College, and also there was at the time, this was about 1962, the Louis Jacobs affair broke, and the Jewish Chronicle at the time took it up as a cause célèbre, and my father was writing very passionately in Rabbi Louis Jacobs' defense, and my father one Shabbat went to Stamford Hill for Shabbat, and everyone in Stamford Hill was rounding on him. And my mother said she felt a little bit sorry for him because everybody was attacking his views. Of course, he became famous for being attacked by everybody. But so my parents met in 1962 in Stamford Hill, got married in December 1962. And then in the 1960s, my father established himself as the weekly columnist in the Jewish Chronicle. He didn't yet have his On the Other Hand column, but he wrote under the pseudonym Ben Azai. It was only, so that was about the 1960s. It was only about 1978 that the column finally appeared under his own name, On the Other Hand. But actually, Ben Azai column in the Jewish Chronicle, in most weeks were written by him. Altogether, he has actually wrote a regular column all the way up to his death. I believe the week he died was the first time he's missed being able to write it. During the time that my father was at the JC, we went on Aliyah twice. We went on Aliyah in 1973 and in 1982. Unfortunately, every time we went to Israel, a war broke out. 1973, the Yom Kippur War. In 1982, the Lebanon War. As Anglo-Jewry's columnist-in-chief, my father was a staunch Zionist, but he also felt it was his responsibility to admonish, educate, and point the way forward. And, when he saw things going on in Israel that he didn't agree with, he felt he had to say it. And, I just recall that during the early 1980s, there were a series of bombings carried out by Jewish terrorists. And my father was one of the early journalists who actually called it out for what it was actually identified it, Jewish terrorists being behind it. And at the time, my father got a ton of mail, a sack of mail arrived at the Jewish Chronicle, calling my father a self-hating Jew. There were letters calling for his removal. It was a very, very difficult time. And, my father, he built up a reputation for the fact that there were no sacred cows. He would frequently criticize his friends, regardless of who they were. Truth is, nobody escaped his criticism. I remember, he'd attack the Orthodox rabbinate one week, but then he'd attack a Reform rabbi the following week. And in fact, one week I remember, a few occasions actually, my father davened at the Stiebel in the Bishop's Avenue, and Rabbi Chaim who was a dear friend of ours. One week, he actually went up to my father and said, "Oh, I agreed with you this week. It was wonderful what you said." My father went, "Oh my goodness, what have I done?" So I think that was something that I was very proud of. That he wasn't scared of saying what he believed, even if it upset people. Just briefly about his books, he published 30 books over his lifetime. But he's best known really for most of his books that he wrote were non-fiction, were fiction. But he's best known for his non-fiction books. In particular, there was a whole compilation of his books published. On the other hand, which were published in 1982, I think, and then there was Murmurings of a Licensed Heretic, 1990, and then there was a posthumous edition of, on the other hand, published after his death. But he also wrote a number of really important books if you want to study the history of Anglo-Jewry. There's Troubled Eden, which is an account of Jews in Britain. There's The Cousinhood, about the Anglo-Jewish gentry. The Jews, which deals with every aspect of Jewish achievement. There's the biography, authorized biography of Lord Jacobowitz, 1990. He was, I remember listening to recordings of his interviews with Lord Jacobowitz, and it's an example of how he, whilst he was very critical of many rabbis, he had a lot of very close friendships with rabbis as well, and they valued his opinion, they valued listening to him, they cherished it. So he also collaborated in a number of in some books that were not his books. So he worked with Michael White. Some of you remember Michael Weitzman, who used to occasionally give a shir at the shir group in Hampstead Garden Suburb, and he wrote a book called Ebla about Assyrian civilization. And my father travelled to Syria to help with that book. So I want to basically just end. I'm going to skip slides because I'm just aware that time is of the essence tonight, and then we do have other speakers today. My father, in addition to his books, he also dramatized a number of. He was involved in a number of plays which were on television. He wrote Tales of the Unexpected. He also wrote a number of scripts for radio and television. There was some of you might remember the BBC play Pews. There's also the Squire of Bar Shachar, which was serialized on the radio. And also, our family were featured in a TV series called Everyman. So I want to, just moving on, I can't basically go through tonight without talking about my father's love of food and of whiskey. One fact you might not know about my father is he actually wrote a number of reviews of non-kosher restaurants. How did he do it? He actually brought friends with him to the restaurant. They tasted the food. He wrote the reviews. But he loved good whiskey. And one memory that I'm sure Vivian you'll remember is that every Shabbat Shuvah and Shabbat Hagadol, Rabbi Vishansky would give a very long drasha, usually somewhere close to an hour. And my father would have a bet on sort of how long the speech would be. And my father won every time. And it was alleged that my father and Rabbi Vishansky had fixed it so that my father got the bottle of whiskey. Just speaking briefly about family life. My father married in 1962, had 4 children: Aliza, Azzy, myself, Evie, who we missed terribly, who died in 2001, who was ill for a long time. And I think it was my sister's illness was very traumatic for my father because he'd lost his sister to cancer. My sister joined the army in Israeli army in 1982 at the age of 18 and has lived in Israel ever since. And my father was very proud of her. My brother went on Aliyah in 1993. My late sister Evie also acquired my father's wit and gift for writing. But unfortunately her life was cut tragically short. I have very happy memories of not just Shabbat and family times together, but also going to the countryside, going on country walks. I think my father's love of the countryside goes back to the fact that during his life in the shtetl, he had such happy memories of his time in the country with the children, and I think that lived on in his kind of enjoying going on walks together. So I really want to just end really with with his final days, which was the fact that my father's life in some ways ended where it started. Towards the very end of his life, my father wrote a book called Genesis, and it was intended to be the first installment of his autobiography. With typical Chaim Bermant chutzpah, he saw this as the first of 5 books about his personal life. That's the reason why he called it Genesis. He intended the consecutive books to similarly be, named after the Bible. In Genesis, which was published posthumously in 1998, my father recalls his childhood spent in the Latvian shtetl of Borovka, where his father was rabbi in the years before the Second World War. My father used to often talk about Indaheim, talking about his childhood. What was particularly traumatic is shortly before he died, he discovered there were some childhood friends who he thought had perished in the Holocaust, and discovered that they were still alive in Israel, and went over to see those friends. And whilst he was out there, he contracted gastroenteritis, became very ill, and passed away when he arrived back to England. But I think that was very, very traumatic for him. Just that discovery that childhood friends who for decades he believed had died, had been murdered, were alive and well. So I want to just really end by with one of my father's quotations. My father was known as Chaim Itzik, or Chaim Yitzchak. Chaim coupled with Itzchak, or Isaac, means life. So Chaim in Itzik is life and laughter. I've done my best to live up to both. What I'd like to do is invite Rabbi Jeffrey Cohen to come and say a few words.
Mr. Chairman, members of the family, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great privilege for me to have been invited by the family to say a few words this evening. I've been asked to speak on the theme of Chaim's Jewish values, and already quite a number of the points that I wished to have made have been touched upon. The mere fact that one can highlight such a dimension of his outlook and his emotion is more than significant, because the nouns journalist and religious values are rarely found in apposition. Indeed, in the popular imagination, they're considered an oxymoron. But not so in Chaim's case. As has been said, he was a man of integrity, with a moral conscience rooted in his unwavering commitment to the teachings and the principles of his faith. He studied his Torah, he researched it, he loved, and he lived by it. Those were the values that underscored everything that he wrote as a columnist, and the blatant flouting of which, within our Jewish community and within Israeli politics, and to some extent society, he regarded as his mission to expose. His religious identity, as we heard from Danny, was forged by his parents and especially by his father, Reb Azriel Bermant, a rabbi of 2 communities in Latvia, Talmudic scholar. And when the family moved to Glasgow, Chaim entered the city's yeshiva. Now, having myself served as a rabbi in Glasgow for some 10 years, I had the privilege of knowing and befriending his Rosh HaYeshiva, Reb Naftali Shapiro, a disciple no less of the Chafetz Chaim. So I know the standards of the Glasgow Yeshiva. They were high. It had a very fine reputation. And Chaim maintained that love of learning, that absorption in the classical texts throughout his life, and he sought to communicate their glory and the profundity of the Talmud to his friends, and if I may say especially to his fellow members of the Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue, wherein he established what was known as the Shiur group. It attracted people to study, to listen to distinguished speakers, and to participate in high-level discussion of the weekly Sidra. And again, to be mentioned, his co-organizers were the late and much missed Dr. Michael Weitzman, Dr. Joseph Jacobs, the brother of Chief Rabbi Jacobowitz, all of blessed memory. Chaim sought to encourage the members of the group to think outside the box, to offer their own insights, as well as to discuss the views of modern scholars and commentators, even those outside the traditional orbit. And that was in the era before the Hertz Chumash became anathema in so many Orthodox circles on account of its inclusion of comments by non-Orthodox and non-Jewish scholars. The irony would certainly not have been lost on Chaim, that Chumash was one of the only commentaries of its day to vigorously, courageously, and academically rebut every argument of those who rejected the doctrine of Torah min Hashamayim, of the divine origin of the Torah. Back to Glasgow Yeshiva. Part of the curriculum of the yeshiva was Musar. Musar means moral and ethical character development, a subject which, to my mind, would benefit Rishi Sunak's school pupils far more than the imposition of any extra doses of mathematics. And I have no doubt that it was that exposure to and internalizing of such elevated and character-developing and enhancing ideas while sitting at the feet of his pious teachers at an impressionable age that prompted the young Chaim to become a doughty warrior throughout his life against hypocrisy and false piety and pomposity and fanaticism. Many would have regarded him as an enigma, given that he managed somehow to synthesize a mindset of tolerance and flexibility and liberality with a passionate commitment to Orthodox Judaism and its way of life. Chaim was an authentic Hillelite, and he inveighed against what he regarded as the unnecessary stringencies that many Orthodox leaders seemed to promote as a veritable halachic philosophy. And this explains the oft-repeated, and it's been repeated already this evening a few times, comment of his, which is especially controversial considering his rabbinic origins, his pedigree. Namely, I believe in Judaism but not in rabbis. It was quoted this week by Gerald Jacobs in his excellent appreciation of Chaim in last Friday's JC. However, I submit that this, in fact, was a tongue-in-cheek, throwaway remark. And I say that because of his close relationship with several rabbis, myself definitely included, and the fact that his penultimate publication was the biography of Chief Rabbi Jacobowitz, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. And I think that his acceptance of that speaks volumes, both for Chaim's objectivity on the one hand, and for the Rav's unique qualities as he perceived them on the other. It's not an exaggeration to say that with his vast bushy beard, his bright eyes, his joie de vivre, his vigorous participation in any conversation within earshot, he not only resembled the standard image of a classical prophet, biblical prophet, but in many ways he spoke and wrote with the force and the eloquence of members of that fraternity. It's common to describe biblical prophets as forth-tellers rather than foretellers. That's to say that they regarded themselves as being called upon not to foretell the future, but to be forthright in exposing the moral and ethical and spiritual shortcomings of their community, as well as the character flaws of individuals, especially those who occupied positions of leadership and authority. And if you'll forgive a rabbi resorting to homiletics, I would say that given that the prophets generally commenced their calls for justice and ethical living with the words, Ko Amar Hashem, thus says the Lord. And given that the gematria, the Hebrew numerical value of the word ko, kaf he, is 25, I view it as singularly appropriate that the family should have chosen to mark the fourth teller's 25th Yahrzeit with this special commemoration this evening. Because Chaim was indubitably a fourth teller, a journalist, a columnist, an essayist, a novelist, who didn't flinch from telling things as they were. He could burst an inflated ego with a mere turn of phrase, with a dash of irony, with a witty riposte. Many who unworthily posed as belonging to the circle of the great and the good were pulled down from their pedestal, either by Chaim's subtle criticisms or his sharply honed verbal arrows. Significantly, the fact that Hebrew employs the word, the identical root, davar, for both a word and devorah, a bee, indicates its recognition of the powerful sting inherent in a well-chosen word or pointed critique. Friends, I wish to conclude with perhaps the most conspicuous example of Chaim's intellectual honesty, his uncompromising objectivity, which was to draw a sharp distinction between the Orthodox Judaism, whose ethical and moral principles he greatly admired in their original setting, that is, in the codified sources, but which, in his view, did not necessarily translate into policy and action by too many of its self-proclaimed custodians and exponents, especially in the State of Israel. In his words, Judaism is wholesome and benign as long as it is distant from power in Israel. He also found it hard to reconcile the fact that those who claimed to speak in Judaism's name were often hostile to secular Jews or to those who didn't embrace their particular brand of Judaism or their lifestyle. Against the backcloth of medieval Christianity's barbarism, he observed that it became a moral force only when it ceased to be a political one. And like the prophets of old, lahavdil, that the power of the Pope lay in the fact that he had no power, but considerable influence. And for the same reason, he fearlessly took on the then Prince Charles to task for his expression of blanket admiration of Islam. And hence my depiction of Chaim as having been in the true mode of the forth-telling prophet. and because his weekly JC column addressed pressing national and international and communal and religious issues, his was the very first page, as we heard, that many admitted to opening of the JC each week. And as a rabbi, I can reveal that many of my colleagues culled Chaim's themes and ideas on a regular basis and to powerful effect as the basis for their Shabbat sermons, and gained much from his weekly masterclass in the art of essay writing. And so we fondly recall this evening a writer of acclaimed literary talent, a man of great moral stature, a thinker, a commentator, possessed of great wit and perception, and a learned and observant Jew who exposed and bemoaned the disparity between religious theory and practice, and a man who, to paraphrase Kohelet chapter 9, verse 9, enjoyed life with the wife that he loved all the days of his life, with Judy, and derived great pride and nachat from his children, Azzy and Zoe, Danny and Miriam, Aliza, Amir, and Evie, Aleha Hashalom, and from their grandchildren and all their family. We wish all the family Arichat Yamim for the Yahrzeit this coming week, continued pride in the legacy, the values, and the Shem Tov that he has bequeathed to you all, and in the knowledge that he was not only irrepressible, but also irreplaceable, and continues to be missed within our community all these years following his passing. Yehi zichro baruch, may his memory be for a blessing. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Dr. Jeffrey Cohen, for those beautiful words. I would now like to invite Vivian Wyman to come up and say a few words.
Rabbi Lister, Rabbi Cohen, the Mant family, and friends, we're here this evening to commemorate the 25th anniversary of Chaim's passing. But more importantly, we're here to celebrate the life of a great communal figure. For me, he was a shul colleague, a political ally, and above all, a very good friend. Recently, there's been much publicity about the rights and wrongs of people who have deceased and how difficult it is for them to rise above the circumstances in which they live and in which they were brought up. We've realized that asking questions like, was Shakespeare a racist, was Dostoevsky an anti-Semite, are really unfair. People have to be seen in the context of their environment. It takes a truly great man to rise above the circumstances in which he's been brought up and to see beyond them to a new morality. And Chaim Bermant was such a great man. You've heard just now from Danny, who has actually taken much of my powder away from me, about his upbringing. He was brought up in Belarus, born in 1929. Belarus was part of Jewish Lithuania. And he was brought up in a town which saw one of the most unspeakable atrocities of the Holocaust. He then came to Scotland, where he was raised. He was, as he described himself, a Litvak fallen among Scots. He's had great pride in his Lithuanian ancestry. My own family followed a similar trajectory. And he was part of the religious Zionist movement. When he was 19 years old, he was witness to the birth of the State of Israel. Hatikva Shnat Alpayim, the hope of 2,000 years, Liyotam Chofshi Ba'artzenu, to be a free people in our land. This tremendous excitement. I was not born at the time. 19 years later, we had the culmination of that in the Six-Day War. By then, I was a schoolboy, already very, very cognizant of what was taking place. I remember being in Hyde Park Corner, being addressed by the President of the Board of Deputies, who described the people of Israel as a beleaguered remnant of a martyred people. And then we saw the war break out. And on the third day of the war, we heard that laconic announcement on Israeli army radio, Har Habayit Biadenu, the Holy Mount, the Temple Mount, is in our hands. And this huge surge of euphoria came throughout the Jewish world. Even people who were critical of Zionism, like the philosopher Hannah Arendt, was known to be like a war bride. I remember I was at a non-Jewish school and going into Jewish prayers and reading out Shir HaMalot, when the Lord returned the captivity of Zion, we were like unto them in the dream. It was like a dream come true. But then we realized that things were a little bit more complicated, that along with the beautiful bride of all this territory that had been acquired, there was a hoika, there was a dowry of millions of people who did not want to live under Israeli rule. And people took time before they realized the complication here. The philosopher Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who came from the same part of the world as Chaim, said he realized it on the seventh day. The counsel to the Israeli government, Idor Meron, one of the greatest international lawyers of our generation, already realized a couple of months after the war that the construction of settlements in the West Bank would not be in accordance with international law. Chaim realized this fairly soon. It took others much longer to realize that Israel was confronted with a problem. And this hurt Chaim particularly, because here was a man who was a dedicated Zionist, who'd been brought up inside the Jewish community, who loved Israel, who took joy in its success and great joy in its victories, but was aware of the moral complications that came with them. And he took his stand openly, and naturally he took a lot of flack for it. I know, because I was just a tiddler on the side and saw how angry people could get. I was called an anti-Semite, a self-hating Jew. I was even called a Hellenist. Recently, some leading right-wing figure in the Board of Deputies described me in the presence of my dentist as being a Trotskyite. I had no idea that I could be that. I thought I was a bloated plutocrat. And of course, this dentist, she was a black receptionist. She had no idea what it meant either. And she said, "Are you really a Trotskyite?" But Chaim would put up with this with great ease, because his criticisms, they were not with vitriol, they were with honey. He, as Gerald Jacobs said in his appraisal of Chaim, he always dealt with it in a witty fashion, and he rose above all the communal flack that was thrown at him, and he dealt with it very, very comfortably. He was, of course, extremely funny, and this was something that we took great pleasure in the Stiebel of Bishop's Avenue, where he had a gifted straight man as his partner, Rabbi Wolshansky, and he was just extremely entertaining. Rabbi Wolshansky had a practice before the Chagim of giving an account of the laws relating to the Chagim. So one year, it came before Pesach, and Rabbi Wolshansky was talking about the fact that Jews are not meant to eat matzah in the month before Pesach. And Rabbi was very strong about this, and he said, we've been told by Chazal that someone who eats matzah in the month before Pesach is the same as if he sleeps with his wife before they're married. And Chaim said for the back, no, it's quite different, not the same at all. And he had that light touch which could actually diffuse all these situations. But the fun was always there, and also what was always there was the love of his family. And Danny has mentioned, on a sad note, Evie, how terribly sad it was for him when she was ill, how he would wake up in the morning thinking of her, and it would be with him all the day. And then what pleasure he took with his other children. And I still remember at Eliza's wedding, he said that if Eliza is half as good a wife as her mother is, she'll make my son-in-law extremely happy. Well, that was 30 years ago. My own daughter got married just 4 years ago, and I thought, here's a chance to plagiarize Chaim's remarks. So I did that. I said that, and I was very honest. I said, if Ronit would be half as good a wife as her mother, she'll make Deebs very happy. But I didn't acknowledge Chaim's copyright, but I do freely now. We had many, many points in common. We shared a taste in whiskey. We shared a taste in Stiebler. We were both left-handed. We were regarded as both being left-wing in politics, but we weren't. I think it was just common decency, common humanity in both of us. And we also have the same names. They're very common names, but the combination is quite unusual. Chaim, which all across the Jewish world. It's a lovely name meaning life. And in Russian, it's Vitali. In Italian, it's Vivanti. In the UK, it's Vivian. And his second name, Yitzhak, laughter. He was very conscious of these. And they're also Zionist names. The first president of the State of Israel, Chaim Weizmann. The second president of the State of Israel was Yitzhak ben Tzvi. So it brought together his ambitions, which he said in his life, and which Danny has touched on, that laughter and life were goals that he aspired to throughout his life. He aspired to, and he succeeded in them. And as a result, he's left the most wonderful legacy for all of us. Now, Chaim's footprint was much greater than many people realized. After his death, he actually had an obituary in The Economist, which is probably one of the most prestigious journals in the world. And when it was known that we were having this evening, I got a message from William Morris, the chairman of the trustees of the Next Century Foundation, that he wanted to send a message, which he's now given me here, and which, if people will allow me, I will read out. I've cut it short because time is short. But this is what William Morris wanted to say about Chaim. Chaim Bermant was an outstanding man of our time. I first met him at meetings of the Next Century Foundation. This is a Track 2 diplomacy group that works with the United Nations, and which Chaim introduced me to, where we discussed Israel and particularly Jerusalem. He loved Jerusalem and cared for all its inhabitants. My own edition, of course, we say in Tehillim, Shalu Shalom Yerushalayim, seek the welfare of Jerusalem, Yishlayu Ohavayach, may those that love you prosper or have serenity. Present at our meetings were pioneers of interfaith work in this country. Sheikh Zaki Badawi, KBE, the Muslim founder of the Three Faiths Forum, Lord Arnold Weinstock, Herschel Gluck, and Bishop Hugh Montefiore. Chaim's interventions were the right words at the right moment and had a great calming effect. He was more than a great journalist. He was a deep thinker who influenced many people. I think that's a very fair verdict of him. And I would like just to add to that, and as Rabbi Cohen said, Yehi Zichro Baruch, may his memory be for a blessing.
Thank you very much, Vivian, for those beautiful words. Just your words bring back so many happy memories from the Stiebel. I was to have invited, my father worked with Gerald Jacobs at the Jewish Chronicle. Unfortunately, Gerald is unwell and unable to make it this evening. What I'd like to do now is ask family to come and speak. So, firstly, Azzy, if you could come and say a few words.
I remember going back to, it must have been the end of 1983. There was a rally for Soviet Jewry, and I remember I went with my father and noticed during the rally some fellow started yelling at my father, and this is something that hit me hard because I realized, I think this was for me, I was still I was young, I was only 14, 15, and this for me was a sign that my father, in his writing, he was willing to take risks, was willing, in his passionate views about issues relating to Israel and Judaism, he was prepared to speak his mind and go out on a limb, even if this meant that he was disliked in some circles and people did not like what he had to say. And certainly on the issue of Israel, he cared very passionately. He would describe himself as someone who had liberal sentiments with a conservative disposition. When it came to Israel, he simply, he disliked injustice, cruelty, oppression. And the thing to emphasize here is my father could not be easily pigeonholed because in many ways he was actually quite conservative in his views. He was very much, for example, an admirer of Margaret Thatcher. And I remember my sister Evie getting quite upset with him when he was saying how wonderful Margaret Thatcher was. He also was very much a traditionalist, was quite conservative on social issues, such as, for example, homosexuality, which today would be considered very much not acceptable. But interestingly, on other issues, such as Israel, he was actually progressive in his ideas. For example, I'll give you an example. When regarding Menachem Begin, my father wrote back in 1982, to the humane, compassionate and liberal, the Palestinians are now the Jews, while the Jews proper, as represented by Begin and his supporters, no longer seem Jewish because they display attitudes which are normally associated with the oppressors rather than with the oppressed. And if this was the case in 1982, can you imagine how much more this is the case today? With you have extreme right-wing parties in government. I'll come to that in just a sec. Now, at the same time, a lot of my father's writing on Israel was laced with humor. For example, in January 1991, he came out to Israel during the Gulf War, and he would talk about how he was terrified of his beard having to cut off his beard so that he could wear his gas mask. This was for him something totally simply couldn't happen. And at one point, there was a burly man who came into the hotel where he was staying and insisted my father had to remove his beard. My father refused, and he said, "Okay, all right." He said, "It's your funeral." And of course, also, my sister Eliza was worried about wearing her mask because she was worried that the cat would be worried, and of course the cat didn't have a mask. But my father was far-sighted, and he could see as Vivian mentioned just before, he was only too aware of the fact that as great as the victory was in the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel occupying Palestinians who did not want to be ruled over would create a problem over time if there was no settlement of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Robin Lustig, a British journalist, who reviewed my father's anthology, on the other hand, in September 1982, described my father as the quiet voice of sanity in a review in the Observer newspaper. Lustig concludes, "Here is the voice of a good man in the right, who now more than ever before needs to be heard." In March 1994, my father wrote an article. There was an appalling incident. Baruch Goldstein, an American Jew who moved to Israel, lived in Hebron, carried out a massacre at the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron. My father wrote about the fact about the dangers of Kahanism, of the extreme right. And he wrote, quote unquote, "Kahanism itself is very much alive in the ranks of Likud and its prospective right-wing allies. What is unthinkable in Israel can soon become acceptable." And unfortunately, my father has been proved right with what we have today, a situation where you have the descendants of the Kach, people who supported the racist Rabbi Meir Kahane, now inside Israel's government, something which would have been unthinkable, almost unthinkable. Many people found my father's views on Israel hard to digest because he didn't hide from the truth. In the same article in 1994, he concluded that the incorporation of the West Bank into Israel while excluding the Arabs from any rights as citizens of Israel would in effect create a South Africa situation with the West Bank forming a sort of tribal homeland. In November 1983, in my father's review of the Amos Oz book, In the Land of Israel, he writes, quote unquote, "Scripture certainly provides precedent for the harshest attitudes, but I find that attitudes are formed first and justification is sought in Scripture afterwards." One is reminded of Swift's quote, "We have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough to make us love one another." He goes on to say, "There is a sane and fair-minded Israel whose voice can be heard in the kibbutzim, the universities and the media, but it no longer carries the weight it did." My father took part in the Peace Now March shortly after the start of the Lebanon War. And sadly, this march ended in the murder of an Israeli, Emil Grunzweig. All the usual, as my father wrote, all the usual epithets were hurled at us: Arab lovers, traitors, sons of whores, and one which was new to me, kibbutznikim. Intellectuals once regarded as the nation's elite are now spoken of dismissively as people of dubious loyalty. And when a television crew went out into the streets to film public reaction to the Kahan Commission, the commission that launched an inquiry into the Sabra Shatila massacre, it was set upon by a mob. There is no silent majority in Israel, or even a silent minority, but only a babel of voices, some of which are louder than others. Amos Oz has caught the loudest in all their stridency. It's as if a large part of the country has turned its back on the prophets and has lined up behind false messiahs. So, again, tragically, what my father foresaw 30, 40 years ago is now sadly unraveling, emerging in Israel. And a lot of these writings I'm quoting are actually not from the Jewish Chronicle, they're actually from his writings in the Observer, where he also had an occasional column. And I want to conclude with this. My father concludes his review of Amos Oz's book. "Given the history of the Jewish people, it is too early to despair. To quote an old-timer, to this
Thank you very much, Asi. I'd now like to invite Alisa to speak.
Good evening, everyone. I'll start by saying that my father, my late sister, described me as not being bilingual, but being alingual, not English or Hebrew. I also take after my father that I speak fast, and I have, he used to say, had a problem with his speech, kaved lashon, as I'm the same way. So I start by saying that I hope you are able to understand what I'm going to read to you tonight. I'm going to share with you an article. I'm not going to read the whole article, but something that he always managed to find a very comic side to everything. And I'm going to give you an example of something he wrote. It's called Computer Yiddish, 5th of March, 1993. I can't spell. You might think this is an odd failing in a writer. It's like being an accountant who can't count. But accountants don't have to count these days, as writers don't have to spell. Their computers do it for them. I can imagine there will be a time, if a time hasn't come already, when doctors have no need to know anything about medicine. How would he know? You can see Google, everything's Google today. All they have to do is to punch symptoms into the computer for it to come up immediately with a diagnosis, prognosis, and likely cure, plus any side effects which might arise from the cure. Similarly, rabbis faced with a halachic problem will no longer have to turn to a higher authority. They will turn to the computer instead, though I'm not sure why they should even bother, because the answer will always be no. My own computer, though I got it wholesale from a good Jewish trader, in fact is thoroughly Goyish and doesn't know a word of Yiddish, nor any Hebrew for that matter. Thus, I only have to press the spell key, and expressions like Bubba, Zayda, Yenta, Shadchan, Mechutan, Schnorra, and Schleimel are instantly changed to boob, zebra, yen, shallow, machimo, mechismo, scorner, and schnitzel. Shortly before Rosh Hashanah, I wrote the following to a friend. Dear Shmuel, just a fine line to thank you for a lovely Shabbos. Your wife, Fruma, is a real Eshes Chayil. What a cook. What a nosh. Her gefilte fish, cholent, kugel, kishka, zimmers, and strudel were out of this world. Are you sure the parav cream on the lokshen pudding was really parav? If so, it was delicious, and I forgive her even if it wasn't. I pressed the spell. I'm not going to read the whole thing because otherwise we'll be here forever. I pressed the spell button, and this is what I got. Dear Shovel, just a line to thank you for your lovely shabby. Your wife, Frudy, is a real SQ chaos. What a cook. What a niche. Her kahana, fish, chalet, kudo, and kibble, times and shrivel were out of this world. But are you sure the partridge cream on the lockjaw pudding was really a partridge? It was so delicious that I forgive her even if it wasn't. Well, either way, I'm wishing you... Oh, sorry. At the end, he writes at the end, wishing you a ktiva v'chasima tova Chaim. And this is the spelling. Wishing you a Kelvin vaccinal toad chain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aliza. Thank you very much, Vivian. Thank you, Arzi. Thank you, Rabbi Jeffrey Cohen. What I'd like to do now is just invite you all up for a l'chaim, as is the minhag on the Yahrzeit like this. If I could just invite Spencer to just close.
I actually searched the JC archives and couldn't find an article I was looking for. Many, many years ago, I think Chaim Bermant visited Edgware, and he wrote an article saying he thought that when they opened the Ark, he thought an express train would come out from there, and and as a result, I seem to remember that the honorary officers at the time banned him from coming back again for some time. Of course, the honorary officers wouldn't do that now, but I couldn't find that article. I'd now like to call on David Lando, chair of Edgware United Synagogue, with a past connection to Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue, to propose a vote of thanks to our speakers.
Firstly, I'd like to apologise why I'm here with a coat and a scarf. I'm particularly cold. If anybody else is cold, please don't blame the show. It's all to do with the heating. The other point about Marmite, it's only the 600 gram which is kosher. The rest aren't for some reason. The other one was that Rabbi Wyshansky was mentioned this evening more than once. I remember him extremely well, and he was a lovely man, really lovely man. First of all, I thank Spencer for putting on another adult education evening that is extremely well attended, and I thank all of you for being here as well. And I thank our speakers, Vivian Wyman, who I know of old, Rabbi Jeffrey Cohen, even further back. And just a story with Rabbi Jeffrey Cohen that back in about 1964 or 65, a television program was made for ATV about Judaism. They asked Jeffrey and Gloria if they would have a typical Friday night in their home and have their children. Their children at the time were babies. And on that occasion, I was invited to be his son. So good to see you again, Dad. And of course, I thank, who else? Tony Honigberg for looking after our sound and light. And most importantly, I thank Danny, Azzy, Elisa for obviously bringing the life and legacy of your father to everybody here who didn't know him. And I wish you a Chaim Aruchim, and may his memory be a blessing. I thank you all. Thank you. Good night.